He's John Timpane.
And he's Don Rooney.
And this is
The Musical Innertube.
Now, you may ask, why is this podcast called The Musical Innertube?
And we may reply, because that's its name, of course.
Now, how did this podcast get that name?
Back in college, we hosted a radio show. Once, we tried to introduce a soothing musical interlude.
Instead, we messed up and wound up introducing a soothing musical innertube, and the name stuck.
So here we are, hundreds of years later, still talking
to interesting people about their interesting lives.
Difference makers who really make a difference. Our very special guest on this episode of the Musical Innertube is Sam Pollard, filmmaker, screenwriter, editor, producer, and master documentarist. His work includes 2 episodes of the series Eyes on the Prize 2, several projects with Spike Lee, including When the Levees Broke and If God is Willie and the Creek Don't Rise, 2 much awarded documentaries about New Orleans, Katrina, and the British Petroleum Oil Leak. And his films have won Emmys, Peabody Awards, and even an Oscar nomination for Best Documentary for the 1997 Spike Lee film, 4 Little Girls. On top of all this, Sam is a professor at Tisch School of the Arts at New York University. His latest documentary, The League, on the birth, rise, and fade out of the Negro baseball leagues between about 1920 and 1948, is out now in theaters and streaming services. Amir Questlove Thompson of The Roots is executive producer. Go see the film. It's terrific. Welcome, Sam Pollard.
My pleasure, John. Thanks for having me.
You bet. Many folks, when they think of the term baseball team, they think of 18 players in hats and uniforms contending on a diamond-shaped playing field, but your film sees it differently. A team there is also the people in the front office, the personal lives of the players, and perhaps most important, the community that enjoys and supports the team. Why was that viewpoint important to you?
Well, because here we were looking at the Negro League, which came of age in the 20th century during the period of American history that's considered the age of Jim Crow and segregation. So we knew that it was important not just to tell a story about the exploits of the players on the field, but to understand the communities in which they played in, be it in New York City, be it in Chicago, be it in Los Angeles, be it in Birmingham, Alabama, or Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and to get a sense of what those communities were like going to ball games and enjoying themselves during a time where they had to survive in their own community. The other thing that we wanted to make sure we put across is the fact that not only were these Negro League teams providing entertainment, but they were helping to provide economic sustenance for the community. People could go and pay for stuff in the concession stand. They help pay for their tickets to get to the game. And then in turn, those are helping to play the ball players who played those games. And then those people who worked in the concession stands. They lived in the community. They went back and they worked in the stores. They shopped in the stores. They did their business within these self-contained, segregated Black communities. So it was not just about sports. It was about looking at the economic and social engines that happened in these communities in the 20th century.
Which is, I think, probably why the owners of the teams played as important a part in your film as the players did.
Yeah. Well, exactly, Don. I mean, if you think of someone like Rube Foster, who in 1920, who had been a wonderful pitcher, created the screwball, who had been a manager of the Chicago, American Giants, who had been an owner, he decided that it was important for all of these other Negro League teams to come together and form their own Negro National League in 1920 in Kansas City, Missouri. And then later on, 10 years later, you had 2 men, Cum Posey, who owned the Homestead Grays, and Gus Greenlee, who owned the Pittsburgh Crawfords. They, too, were very, very pivotal in helping these teams grow and helping these communities flower. And then in the 40s and the early 50s, we talked about a wonderful owner, Effa Manley, who was the owner of the Newark Eagles, who was also phenomenal and supporting the team, making sure that her players, when they went over into Major League Baseball, for example, like Larry Doby, that he would be compensated. Because the thing we didn't know, that I never knew from knowing a little bit about Negro Leagues, was that Roy Campanella, Jackie Robinson, Don Newcomb, when Branch Rickey signed those 3 players, those 3 great Hall of Famers, he never compensated the Negro League owners, because he didn't think much of them on one hand. But Effa Manley, when Bill Veeck of the Cleveland Indians wanted to sign Larry Doby, she was able to persuade him to pay 10 grand, which is not a lot of money even then, but pay 10 grand for Larry Doby's services.
It's interesting because your film shows a side of Branch Rickey that we don't get often enough, because he's often in historic accounts of Jackie Robinson. He's often almost made a saint, a visionary, by getting.
I know. I mean, everybody thinks of Branch Rickey now as Harrison Ford, man.
Yeah.
And he was, in a sense, a pioneer in that sense.
Oh, he was a pioneer, but, it's sort of like, we know the guys like we growing up in the 50s and 60s. Now, my brain thought Lou Gehrig was Gary Cooper.
Exactly. Yes. And Babe Ruth was William Bendix.
Exactly.
Exactly.
So now we're getting the real truth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the business truth.
And then that was another question that popped into my head while watching it. The Negro Leagues did very well in attendance. They would fill whatever stadiums they had. As a matter of fact, you talk about an East-West All-Star game that would fill Comiskey Park, which is a fairly big venue in Chicago. So how much of Branch Rickey's pioneering vision was tied into the fact that he saw those crowds at those Negro League games and said, maybe I can get them to come to my ballpark and watch my team?
Well, the thing Don, is that as much as we like to think he was all altruistic and wonderful, it was about economics, about money. Clearly, when Branch Rickey probably went to those Negro League games and saw those crowds, he could count dollar signs. And he wasn't wrong. Because what happened? When Jackie got signed, when Don got signed, when Roy got signed, when Larry Doby got signed, the black community, peoples in the black community who would normally go to see the Newark Eagles or the Baltimore Elite Giants that had Roy Campanella, or the Kansas City Monarchs, now those patrons and fans could go to games where they were Major League Baseball, and they could watch those players play in the major leagues, which had a devastating, I'm going to say that word again, a devastating effect on the legacy, on the history of the Negro Leagues in the 50s.
So let me ask you about that. It's often said that success is what killed the Negro Leagues, ironically. But it also is true that the community that had supported the Negro Leagues basically forgot them. I mean, they went to see the players who made it into the major leagues. And one can understand that on one side of things, because this was a symbol of having succeeded where none had succeeded before, a symbol of change, a symbol of maybe things are changing for the better, and maybe even getting the chance to see a black player kick a little white fanny, out on the field, which was certainly, I'm sure, the first persons who ever saw Willie Mays and Hank Aaron and, of course, Jackie Robinson play were just amazed just by how good they were, right, just on the baseline. But why did they basically abandon the Negro Leagues that way?
Well, this is what happens. I mean, this is a complex history of America. I mean, we as black people were seen as second-class citizens. All of a sudden there was this tumult, this energy to be considered first-class citizens, to be equal to white people. And, Jackie Robinson being signed by Branch Rickey and the Brooklyn Dodgers was a major thing for American history. I mean, it was a precursor to Dr. King and to the Civil Rights Movement and to, basically the March on Washington. So this notion that we're going to finally be treated as first-class citizens had to be something that would be exciting. Now, did everyone understand the downside of that? I'm not sure everybody did, but this is that complex reality of life. I mean, it's sort of like, we all know that this new film came out today called Oppenheimer, about Robert Oppenheimer and the creation of the atomic bomb. On one level, they asked, what was the upside of having created an atomic bomb? But what was the downside? Creating this humongous, horrific weapon, And then the other question that someone asked, if they asked in the film, why did you decide to drop it on the Japanese, not on the Germans? So the history is so complicated, which for me as a filmmaker, I always find fascinating. So this idea that black fans would want to go see Jackie, on one hand, makes sense. But did they understand the impact it would have on their own communities? I don't think anybody really understood that until the 70s and the 80s, the impact, integration would have on these Black communities and on the Negro League.
Speaking of history, in following the history of the Negro Leagues in your film, it pretty much follows the history of how Blacks lived in America. When the first teams were formed in the early 1900s, it was part of that Black migration out of the South and into the urban areas. And then when they got to those urban areas and they formed their own little areas in which to live and thrive and open their own businesses and eventually their own ball teams. And then after World War II, that's when we saw the push for integration, not just in ball players, but across the board. And that sort of, again, is portrayed in the Negro Leagues as well as in society as a whole. So it does seem like the way that entertainment goes, they always say that the people in a given situation are 2 steps ahead of the officials. They're already doing something that eventually Washington or the city or the state or whatever catches up with. And that seemed to be the case with the Negro Leagues, that they were portraying in the way that the ballparks were built, the players were playing, that the crowds were coming. They were portraying what was happening in the Black community at the time.
Well, that's actually right, Don. I mean, the thing is, it's sort of like, this form of entertainment brought people together, but then when some of our major players, like Jackie, like Willie Mays, like the young Hank Aaron, like an Ernie Banks, when they went over to the major leagues, these players brought their fans with them, which is not unnatural, but it's this duality that we always constantly are challenged by in America. This notion of what it means to be integrated and what it means to be segregated. Is America ever going to really live up to, some of these credos that Dr. King talked about? So it's always a challenge. I mean, to me, it's a wonderful level of complexity that makes America such an interesting place to live in.
What were some of the challenges to you as a person putting together this documentary? What were some of the filmmaking challenges? So we could talk baseball all day, but I'm just wondering, what were the challenges in making a movie about this very complex process?
Well, the first challenge was, and we talked about this a lot in my team, was there material? Was there enough archival material to tell this story? And our first reaction was, because I had seen some, and my story producer had seen some, and the executive producer had seen some, we were pretty terrified there wasn't going to be enough archival material, to tell the story. So we brought in a wonderful archival producer named Helen Russell, who was based out of Boston, who had done lots of sports shows. He had just finished working with me on my Bill Russell documentary series for the Netflix called Bill Russell, the Legend. And I said, Helen, you really need to go into a deep, deep dive to see if there's any other material besides what we've seen so many times. And she reached out to a lot of Negro League aficionados, people who love the history and the evolution of Negro Leagues and knew every kind of player that played, many more than I knew about. And she was fortunate that she was able to find, through these different sources, more material, not only archival footage, but more archival photos, more archival placards, game tickets, all kinds of stuff, which was great. So that was one thing that we sort of were able to say, you can take a deep breath. The second thing we decided in terms of how to tell the story, as we were thinking about if we had enough archival material in terms of footage and stills and placards, we said to ourselves, should we consider shooting recreations? Now, that word recreations always scares me a little, because what does that mean? You're basically trying to turn something that's a documentary, you're trying to create some dramatic moments that elevate the story. But the challenge with doing recreations and documentaries is, do you have the budget to make them look really good in terms of production value? And we had to see if we had the budget, if we could find the people who could play baseball. And so we came up with some storyboards about what kind of things we wanted to see, maybe like bunting, running, stealing bases, catching balls in the outfield, sewing pictures. So we had our producer go down to Birmingham, Alabama, where Brickwood Stadium is, which was home of the Birmingham Black Barons, to really cast college students who played ball, who played baseball. And he was very lucky. He found some good students who could play ball. Because then we said, well, now we got to get their costumes. We got to get Kansas City Monarchs. We got to get, the Memphis team. We got to get, some Birmingham Black Bears. We got to get these different uniforms. So then we brought in a costume designer to create the uniforms. And then we brought someone in to get the gloves. And the biggest challenge these young players had was catching balls with those gloves that was from that period. Because there's no real, mitt inside those gloves. So that was the biggest challenge for them. And then, so after we decided to do recreations, then we had to figure out if we had enough budget to be able to do them. Now, initially, guys, I wanted to shoot for 5 days. I felt if I had 5 days of shooting, I could get everything I wanted. So we went back to our executive producers, because the always thing with filmmaking is about money. Went back to our executive producers. We gave them our budget. We said 5 days. They love the idea of recreations, but they balked at the idea of shooting for 5 days. They said, Sam, is there any way you can shoot this in 3 days? My first reaction was, God, no, I can't shoot this in 3 days. It's too much material. And I was also going to shoot a scene where Rube Foster brought together all the Negro League owners to create the Negro National League. So that was another setup. We had the ball field. We had the indoor shooting. So we sat down with my producer, my story producer, our executive producer, Dave Saronic, and we figured, okay, if we're smart enough, if we're strategic enough, we could get everything done in 3 days, which we did, But in terms of elements, then as we were starting to put the film together, we thought another element that could really take the film to a really higher level was the animation. Again, it was trying to figure out how much we needed, how much it would cost, And that's always the biggest challenge with these films. The things I want, my dream scenario is to have everything I want to give me $3 million. But I couldn't get everything I want, and they wasn't going to give me $3 million.
We'll rejoin our podcast in just a moment, but first, here is a soothing musical interlude.
Sam Pollard is a much-awarded filmmaker, director, editor, producer, and writer. His film highlights include episodes of Eyes on the Prize 2, Citizen Ash, a documentary about tennis great Arthur Ashe, several films with Spike Lee, including Mo Better Blues, Clockers, and Four Little Girls, and films on Martin Luther King, Pete Seeger, and Joe Papp.
With Spike Lee, Pollard created When the Levees Broke and If God Is Willin' and the Creek Don't Rise, a 2-part documentary about New Orleans, Hurricane Katrina, and the British Petroleum Oil Leak. He has won Emmys, Peabody Awards, an Oscar nomination for Four Little Girls, plus a Career Achievement Award from the International Documentary Association.
Sam Pollard is also a professor at the Tisch School of the Arts at New York University. You can check out that website at Tisch, that's tisch.nyu.edu.
And now we return you to the musical Innertube, already in progress.
How much did your background as an editor, because a lot of the times you work with Spike Lee, you worked as an editor. How much did your background as an editor help you as a director in envisioning what these scenes needed to look like and what you needed to put them together?
Don, the answer is always. Always. Because I've been editing, guys, since 1975. And I started on film. And I've edited, I was counting it up the other day. I probably edited like 40 documentaries and 11 feature films, And so all that experience has basically given me the confidence, pretty much most times, to understand exactly what I need to shoot, the kind of coverage I need to get for every scene, so I'll be able to cut it in the edit. I try not to overshoot, but I'm pretty good about understanding what I need in terms of making the scene happen. because I've edited, Don, you're right. I've edited so many things. I've edited documentaries. I've edited films for Spike. I edited action films for Ernest Dickinson. So I've approached films from so many editorial perspectives. I have a sort of a big picture about how to put a scene together.
There's much talk about this being our style of baseball. That there was a style of baseball that in a way was owned by the community, or the community felt was theirs because it was the way their players played. What was black baseball? How is it different from other kinds? Can you define that for us?
I would say this, in my Bill Russell documentary, I interviewed another colleague, filmmaker, writer, Nelson George. And at one point in the film, he said, John, when Wilt Chamberlain, Bill Russell, Elgin Baylor came into the NBA, they brought with them the black athletic aesthetic. What did that mean? That mean they brought a different kind of approach to how they dribbled, how they did layup shots, how they did defending. They brought a different whole approach to the game. The same holds true for baseball. If you think about the Negro Leagues, and you look at some of the footage, Jackie Robinson from the late 40s, early 50s, when he's on those base paths, when he's on first base and he's thinking about stealing second, and he goes as far as he can before he knows the pitcher's going to try to pick him off, she's dancing on the field. He's dancing. And he's a precursor. Those Negro League players were doing that all the time. They knew how to run, they knew how to bunt, they knew how to steal. Someone like Cool Papa Bell, they knew how to do that. And if you look at the Major League Baseball from the late 50s to the 60s, and you have certain names, Maury Wills, the Los Angeles Dodgers, Ozzie Smith, St. Louis Cardinals, Ricky Henderson, Oakland A's, Reggie Jackson, you can see Willie Mays. These guys all brought a different kind of energy and athleticism to the game that you didn't see before, So it was like, that's what they brought to baseball, a whole different kind of play. Now, the thing in baseball, and you guys know this, even with all that, baseball is slow. So the reason no one says it's America's pastime anymore is because young people, lots of young people, prefer watching Steph Curry, on basketball or watching, football games like the Baltimore Ravens or something like that. So, I was saying to somebody, when my daughters were in their teens, I took them to a Yankee game. And around the seventh inning, guys, they turned to me and they said, Jack, this game is so boring. Now, for me, I went to a ball game down at Camden Yards last year with my wife, and I sat through the whole 9 innings, guys.
Oh, yeah.
I love watching it. I love being in a baseball stadium. I just love it. I love the yin and yang of the game, the ups and downs, the energy, Sometimes nothing happens for 2 innings, then bang, I love it. But it was a game that most of us used to, when I was young, I grew up loving the 64 Cardinals, which had Kurt Flood, Lou Brock, Bill White on first base, and the great Bob Gibson. They also had Joe Torre and Tim McCarver.
And Mike Shannon.
I love baseball, man. I loved it when I was a kid.
A few weeks ago, one of the Cincinnati Reds, and John knows his name, which escapes me,
De La Cruz,
got on first base and stole second, and then stole third. And then when nobody was looking, he stole home. And not only was that fun to watch, but he was having a hell of a time doing it. When he got to home base, there was a smile on his face, and he was, high-fiving everybody in the dugout. That was fun to watch. And that clicked on my mind when I was watching the league, is I said, that's the baseball that you're talking about when you're talking about the Negro Leagues, not mashing homers, but going out there and playing what we call small ball.
Exactly. Playing small ball.
It marries ability with style.
That's a great way to phrase it. I'm going to steal that, John.
Please. And copyright 2023, John DePay. But I remember first seeing Willie Mays and just loving the way that he looked like he was just enjoying himself and running and playing the outfield. People would watch him and not watch the plate because it was just so great to see him just chatting and being part of the game. And Clemente, although not American, did bring the same sort of consciousness of style. I saw him throw to second base out of his mitt. I didn't like a highlight throw during a game against the Dodgers. And I said to Dad, "Did you see that?" And Dad said, "Yeah, I still don't believe it." I mean, it's creativity, it's style, it's of course amazing achievement physically, but you have to be able to imagine it. You have to be able to imagine doing that with a certain flair.
That's exactly right.
And Ozzie was the one, of course, that came out before the game and did a complete flip. Again, that speaks to the athleticism, but also just to having fun out there and understanding it's a game and you're out there to be competitive, but you're out there to have fun.
Exactly.
Talk about Spike Lee and Questlove for a moment. You've worked with these great folks, and this is a ridiculous question, Sam, but I'm going to ask it anyway. I mean, what kinds of things do you pick up from just working with people like that? Just as a filmmaker, obviously you know everything about making films, but I'm sure there's always something you stand to learn by being with people like that.
Well, listen, anytime you collaborate in the process of making a film, for me as an editor, later as a producer, and then as a director, it's a marriage. It's a marriage where, like all marriages, there's pluses and minuses, and if the marriage is going to last a long time, you figure out how to negotiate pluses and minuses. So speaking specifically about Spike, I would say to you guys, he's one of the most talented directors that cinema has ever produced. That's number one. And the second thing, in terms of our working relationship, he was always a man of very few words. He's not a talker. He didn't come in with lots to say and have lots of conversations. We would look at dailies. We would talk about what he liked in certain scenes, like with Denzel or Wesley Snipes or, any other films I cut for him. And then I would go and I would work. And then when I would edit a scene and put it together, I would show it to Spike, and he'd give me his reactions. It was always very straight. This is how I react to it. And then I would make alternate changes. I always say to people that we did, I guess, 5 or 6 films together. And it was always one where he understood what I could bring to the table, particularly on the documentaries, but he always knew what he liked. He never was a director who was hesitant or confused about the direction of a sequence. He always knew exactly what he liked, and he knew exactly what he didn't like. And he never had any problems telling me, "I don't like this, man. I don't like where this is going. I think you need to do," he never had a problem. So to me, it was one of those collaborations where I was extremely surprised when he first reached out to me, and then when we started working together, I thought, well, what's he going to be like? How difficult? Because, he has a reputation of being a very difficult guy. But for him and myself, we never had any really rough patches, I would say that, through up until, I think the last time I worked on with Spike was in 2010 when I did If God Is Willing. And, we were colleagues, and collaborators. And for me, some of my editorial best work is in some of those films.
I think that those two films, When the Levees Broke and If God Is Willing, they flow. There's you maybe feel this way yourself, Sam. There's a certain rhythm to them that helps tell the story in such a persuasive fashion. And that's got to be partly you and Spike working together that way.
Yeah, I would say you're absolutely right. I would say that we were able to find a creative language that we didn't always talk about, but we were constantly in sync. So, for example, when we did Four Little Girls, and I was not only the editor, I was a producer on that one. I went with Spike down to Birmingham to interview the parents of the girls who had been killed in the 16th Street bombing. And then when we got back to New York, after we had shot in Birmingham and some other places, Spike and I would meet at 40 Acres, his office, his production office, every morning for 2 weeks at 7 a.m. And him and I would sit and watch all the interviews together. We both had big binders with the transcript, and we would go through them. We would talk about what we liked, what we didn't like. And one of the most important questions Spike asked me about Four Little Girls was, at the very beginning of our screening process, he said, do you think we're going to need a narrator to help tell the story? And I turned to Spike and said, I think with all the people that you've interviewed, we don't need a narrator. They'll be able to bring us all the elements to tell that story and help that story unfold. And that's what we did, and he was very attentive to what I was talking about as an editor, particularly of documentaries, because he knew my work as a documentary editor. But, it was interesting. It was always a good collaboration. I mean, and as much as sometimes my ego would say, I don't want to be Spike Lee's editor, it was fine.
I just think that Questlove is such a scholar, right? Whether you're talking about music, whether you're talking about film, whether you're talking about popular culture. I mean, this is a guy who dives deep and tries to learn everything that he can absorb. I mean, it's quite prodigious when you think about it.
Yeah, we had a different relationship. I mean, Quest came on the league because he had heard about the Negro Leagues through his mother, who was from Pittsburgh, I think. And so he was curious about, the Pittsburgh Crawfords and the Homestead Grays. And he didn't know a lot, but when he read the proposal and he met them, he knew me. But when he met Byron Modley, whose dad, Bob Modley, had been a former Negro League catcher, he knew that he was something he wanted to be involved with. Now, in that particular film, we would send cuts to Quest, and we would get his reaction. And probably the most important input we got from Quest was what he thought in terms of our music choices, what we're thinking about in terms of a musical perspective. And he gave some really cogent and important comments about the approach he thought we should be taking musically, which I then passed on to my composer, Catherine Bostic, who's based in Los Angeles. So it was a different kind of relationship. He looked at cuts, but it wasn't like where Spike and I would usually spend days together looking at sequences. This is a different relationship.
The film that he put together on the 69 Harlem Music Fest, oh, geez. That just, that blew me away. And again,
we're talking about Summer of Soul.
Yeah.
Right. And I keep telling people, you've got to see that movie.
Yeah.
I wish I was there.
Another situation of him going into the history, finding something that was ignored and bringing it out. Speaking of which, what do you think of the focus now in the Negro Leagues, where they're getting inductions into the Hall of Fame, and they want to play a game now at an old Negro League ballpark? Is it sort of about time due, or is there something else spurring it on, do you think?
I think it's about time, Don. It'll be next season at Rickwood Stadium in Birmingham, Alabama, and it'll be the San Francisco Giants versus the St. Louis Cardinals. Two teams that by the late 50s and early 60s had lots of Black and Latino players on their rosters. So I think it's about time. I think it's great. And I think there are people, who are in the Negro League world who have been really pushing one person is Larry Lester, who was interviewed in NFL. He's a strong proponent of making sure that people understand the stats of those Negro League players that he's supposed to introduce to the Hall of Fame. So I think it's about time.
I love seeing the new numbers. When you click on, a stats book, a web page, and you see all the Negro League numbers that are now included, it's just wonderful.
It's great. It's great.
It changes the world.
Exactly.
Well, Sam Pollard, I got to say, this has been one of the quickest half hours we've had on the musical Innertube, and you sound like a great guy to go to a game with. So if you ever need people to go to a game with you, let us know. We'd love to treat you to a baseball game sometime. Ladies and gentlemen, the movie is The League. We recommend it to everybody. It's on screens. It's streaming. And if you don't know about the Negro Leagues, you ought to, because it's all American. That's all I can say. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure, gentlemen. Have a good day.
And thank you for listening to the Musical Innertube.
Our lovely little podcast is available everywhere good podcasts are found. Listen on your favorite platform, and if you like what you hear, please give us a good rating.
And spread the word. Tell your friends about the Innertube and let them know they can subscribe to the podcast on our website, musicalinnertube.com.
There you can listen to all of our podcasts, see pictures and biographies of our guests, and contact us. You can even click on the microphone button in the lower right corner to leave us a voicemail.
And don't forget to leave your email address on our Talk to the Tube page so we can stay in touch.
And you can email us directly at musicalinnertube@gmail.com.
And as always, thanks to virtual band Car Radio Dog for our theme music.